Tricia from the library here. I am back with the next installment in our series called Taste a Title. This series is for middle grade readers to get an idea of some titles that are out there for them to read that are freely available online that you can access from home. I'll read an excerpt of a book each week and you can decide if you would like to continue reading it. If you do, I have put the instructions on how to access this specific title along with this video so that you can read it from home and finish it out. Prologue, the famous and the ordinary. Sometimes, even today, magic still happens. Sadly, it no longer comes from cauldrons or fairy godmothers with wands, or even, no matter what you've read elsewhere, from wizards. Instead, it's tucked inside shadows and corners, visible only if you look. But you might have found it some years ago on a cold, rainy night at a famous hotel in the center of an old city in Europe. Anyone who cared to pay attention that night would have seen magic coming out of its deep slumber at the exact moment when an old dragon and a young girl met for the first time. The dragon was no ordinary dragon. Although Vienna, the old city with the famous hotel, was full of dragons, all claiming to be famous and special, the dragon in question made no such claims. Instead, he thought of himself as hopelessly ordinary, especially when compared to his noisy friends at the hotel. They never tired of telling their stories about armies, castles, or kings. Our dragon did have a particularly splendid roar, but he never used it in battle. Magic had yet to claim him for its purpose, as it had each of his friends. He would have been embarrassed if anyone had told him he was destined for great things, but in fact, that is why he was born. The girl, as it turned out, was no ordinary girl either, although she would have certainly have told you that she was. She believed that mirrors don't lie, and her mirror showed a remarkably unremarkable reflection. The magic that existed in her world sang only in poetry, paintings, and colors, or an excellent slice of almond cake. If pressed, she would explain that her father, a famous poet, and her mother, a dead but still famous painter, were the special ones in her family. She herself, although finally 11, was just a girl with no particular talents. Magic is funny in that way. It chooses those who might not choose themselves. In fact, one of the many rules governing the world of magic is that if you pay attention, you will understand how magic has chosen you and why. Chapter 1, Forest Creatures. Back when the world was long ago and far away, deep in the Black Forest, a new dragon was born. The new dragon was known as Tricia, although his parents, in the strange and mysterious ways of grown-ups everywhere, had named him Benevolentia Gaudium. The grandness of Benevolentia Gaudium means kindness and joy, and it was far too grand for daily use, but his parents liked the way it sounded. They had waited 50 years for his arrival and were naturally thrilled with their son. Normally it took 30 or so years for a new dragon to arrive in the world, but the special ones took an extra 20 years. No one knew why the world of magic selected particular dragons to be special, but the signs were always clear. One of those signs was the 50 years of waiting. The more obvious signs almost always had to do with an unusual appearance. So after waiting 50 long years, Grecia's parents were baffled by his ordinary looks. The baby dragon had gold eyes. Violet was the most common eye color for dragons, but there was nothing special about gold. And his scales were shades of green, brown, and orange. There were no fuchsia, no blue, nor any red on him. There was not even a splash of black along the neck that the very best warriors always had. His mother, a national roaring champion, and his father, a well-known sword warrior and fire breather, couldn't understand why they had waited so long for such an ordinary-looking dragon. But if they knew that sometimes magic made an occasional wrong turn, either their baby dragon was perfectly normal or his particular talent had nothing to do with his appearance. Grecia's mother shrugged, and his father went back to work at the battlefields of men. In a way, it was a relief, for now they would not have to hire one of the older, more experienced dragons to teach Tricia how to manage many extraordinary powers. Tricia was born in the year 1803, which turned out to be the last year that any dragon, special or otherwise, was born. There is much debate about why dragons stopped being born, and no one knows the exact reason. Perhaps it is simply that in the years following Grecia's birth, the steam engine was invented, railways were constructed, and light bulbs became the fixture in homes and on streets. As the world of men built new and extraordinary things, the world of magic began to decline. No creature lives beyond its own world, and a dragon is nothing if not a creature from the world of magic. But back in 1803, the year of our dragon's birth, magic was still as common as electricity is today. Dragons, flying horses, poisonous rabbits roamed Europe's famous forests in large numbers and were not considered, by men or other woodland creatures, as anything strange or even wondrous. Instead, the dragons, flying horses, and poisonous rabbits were accepted as natural parts of the forest, much like the trees. And if the creatures of magic were obliged to perform various jobs and tasks in the world of men, it just meant that sometimes they were obliged to leave the forest. Flying horses were used when someone was too ill to send for a doctor or when a message could not be trusted to a servant. Poisonous rabbits, who, save for a small black dot on the back of each ear, looked exactly like ordinary ones, and they served both as spies and assassins. Dragons were created solely for battle. Even more than swords, guns, or cannons, dragons helped to sway a military conflict. Almost always, the side with the most talented dragons won the fight. Fighting was serious business. A good dragon could make or break a royal knight's reputation. Not only that, a single dragon could change the fate of entire kingdoms. In order to prepare for such a future, you might expect that young dragons would be sent to training camps, or be forced into childhood battle drills and endurance tests, or simply take part in endless fighting contests against each other. But that was not how dragons developed their particular talents. Their parents guided them in certain areas, but before that, new dragons were encouraged to discover their own world. As children, all of magic's creatures learned about themselves by being curious about the forest. It was only when Grisha first crept under a low bush that he learned he could change his size. I'm small, he thought, with a mix of alarm and pleasure. What had once been a branch he could trample on was now hovering over his head, and when he crawled out, he returned to his normal size. To experiment, he sought out a large clearing, and sure enough, he grew in size, able to see over the surrounding trees. Although a bit painful if done too often or too quickly, all dragons were able to scale to size. In this way, they can easily pursue a fleeing army into a palace or a fort. Grisha learned to fly the first time he'd wandered too far from home, and had promised to return before sunset. Without even thinking, his wings spread and he soared into the sky. Over time, he learned how to use sense and an internal guide to stay en route. One trick he learned quickly was, on a return trip, to take off from the place he'd landed. That made it far easier to retrace his route. Those were the lessons young dragons were expected to figure out on their own. When they were a bit older, their parents taught them how to breathe fire and to develop a unique roar. Tactical lessons in fighting and haunting came still later, after the forest had taught its living things that staying alive mattered above all else. Grisha loved the forest and all the creatures he met, from the lowly field mouse to the much admired, if rarely seen, mountain lion. He loved the streams, the trees, and the mossy forest. Nothing, not a torn paw pad or scraped scale, ever dimmed his spirits. Other dragons were quick to take offense or find faults in the world, but not Grisha. Even when his father died in an unpleasant incident involving a prince and a magic spell, Grisha's sadness was mostly for his mother, whose tears singed her face and gave her a terrible cough. The older dragon's death happened well before Grisha had had a chance to form any lasting memories of his father. Many dragons born to famous fighters found themselves without one or both parents and without memories of the one who was missing. Grisha did understand that with his father gone, he would have to teach himself to breathe fire, a task almost always left to fathers. This scared him a bit, as it could be dangerous to learn on your own. The fire dragon's breathing is mostly absorbed by their scales, which are designed to help with both flying and fire extinguishing. In the beginning, however, there are always accidents. Grisha singed his lungs, got a very sore throat, and burned the scales all around his nose. Finally, though, he had mastered it. His mother finished grieving rather quickly, for in those days, if you were a dragon and your husband went off to battle, the chances were good that he would not come home. She promptly set about teaching her son to roar. Her roar was, without a doubt, the best in the business, and in no time Grisha's roar sounded somewhat like 18 trumpets, 10 bassoons, and a pair of cymbals banging in your ear. All dragons have roars that sound a lot like military music, but Grisha had something extra. It wasn't an unusually powerful sound, but every now and again Grisha's roar would make his mother stop, think, and take a good look at the beauty all around her. Perhaps the ability to make others pause would be a valuable tool in battle, she thought. She was curious to see what would happen with her rather odd son. Now all that's left is fighting and haunting, his mother said. But you have a few decades before you need those skills. She had no idea, of course, that those decades, and many more, would be stolen from him. Her son would never fight or haunt in the traditional sense. However, his roar held hints of what he would accomplish instead, more than she could imagine, which was probably just as well. Grisha had no sense that either his ear-catching roar or his years-late arrival were the mark of anything special. He was simply relieved that he could put off fighting and haunting. He usually tried to avoid dragons his age. Their boasting about the armies that they planned to slay and the cities they would one day terrify was rather tedious, and so, short of father, but in possession of a roar and somewhat erratic fire breath, Grisha returned to wandering happily through the forests. He loved the way the air smelled of cinnamon and rotten oranges. His heart was glad when he heard the forest streams rushing down the basin where the Danube River began its journey across Europe. He ate only acorns from oak trees, preferring their dark chocolate taste to the sharp vinegar of fir tree cones. Grisha knew in a vague way that he would one day have to leave, but for now he would be content to follow the smells, the sounds, and the feels of the forest. He enjoyed the way that his tongue moved to bring air into the part of his mouth designed for smell. Because dragons shoot fire out of their noses, they never actually use them to smell. For Grisha, breathing through his mouth was an excuse to linger over the first blooms of spring, the wet winter leaves, and the sharp, nutty scent of summer evenings. Grisha would move slowly through sun-drenched clearings, changing size when he pleased and luxuriating in the warm air against his scales. He heard stories about the world of men and how its residents all lived indoors. That life seemed sadly small. Grisha couldn't imagine having to stay the same size to fit into a home's unchanging shape. The silence alone would kill you, he thought. Dragons have such exceptional hearing that they detect even the smallest sound of a grasshopper hopping. Most precious of all to Grisha was the ability he had to concentrate, even as the most distracting and terrifying sounds were taking place. Men became paralyzed with fear and confusion by battle noises, but a dragon calmly went about the task of fighting. In the forest, dragons were the only creatures who slept through lightning storms, but also the only ones who could hear the first footfalls of the enemy. In this way, dragons bore the responsibility of using their abilities to warn and protect all who shared their home. So that is just a small excerpt from the book Language of Spells by Garret Weyr. And again, this is a great book for grades 4 through 7, and you can access it through the instructions that I'm posting with this video. It's important that you access Junior Library Guild through our website, as we have a institutional account with them, which allows you to read their titles for free rather than making your own account. So please access it through our website, and while you're on our website, check out all the other great things that we have and all the resources that we have available to all of our patrons. And please join us next week for our next installment of Taste a Title. Please leave any comments of titles you would like to hear about or genres you would like to hear about. I'm always taking suggestions. And with that, I'll see you next week.